thanks to all of you, the organizers of this great gathering, where we are all learning a great deal from each other, and that is really what we've come for. I've experienced being upgraded once or twice. Once on an aeroplane. I happened to fly from Cape Town to Melbourne, and I got to Dubai, and they said, well, we're changing your seat, and I found myself in business class, and I just pretended that I'm always in business class. You got to pretend that you are used to it. And I once just went to a conference, tried to go to a conference as a participant that was organized, I think it was 2019, organized at Columbia University on restitution, engaging with Savoy. And I got upgraded to being a speaker because one of the speakers did not get a visa. So thank you so much for the experience of being upgraded. It just means that I've got more work to do. So as we speak, there are lots of developments taking place in this field. We are working in a field at the moment of intense development, of intensification of learning, of ideas, of practice, and how do we go about doing the work of restitution? How do we go about doing the work of decolonization? What do we mean by the colonial? All of these questions are always with us as we go through the learning, as we theorize, and as we engage in the practice of rethinking what we mean by museum. And as I speak in this country, I am reminded of 1510, this moment on the banks of the river in my neighborhood, at the confluence of the Liesbeek and the Black River, in a place now called Observatory in Cape Town, where the Portuguese, under the leadership of de Almeida, were defeated by the Cape Khoi after the Portuguese engaged in some cattle raiding. And if that hadn't taken place, then my Portuguese would probably have been better. And it's just very important to think of that site today, because we have been engaging in anti-colonial struggles, and we have learnt about how colonialism does not go away. It does not reside in the past. It lives with you. You live with it. We also are holding this conference just as our colleagues from Tanzania, from the National Advisory Board on Restitution, are making an official visit to Berlin. They've been in Museum Natuurkunde this week. They are in the Humboldt Forum, and they are attending to matters of restitution. And tomorrow, in the afternoon, there will be an opening of an exhibition in Groningen, in Nederland, involving the presence in their collection of a skull of a woman from very close to Cape Town, whose body was illegally disinterred and whose skull was sent to the Netherlands. But a museum which has also discovered that this woman was known in life, and in their collection there are drawings of her face. And so it's always important to think about these real struggles going on as I talk to you about these very issues. And I thought that in order to discuss restitution, which is kind of the main thing that occupies my mind nowadays, that it's necessary for us to step back a little. And I was motivated by the way the conference was framed and how the call for papers, what it expected of us. And I wanted us to think about colonialism, not in the singular, that we do not have a singular experience of something that we can call colonialism across societies, but that we have been made by multiple colonialisms. And at the same time, we have been made by different forms of struggle for freedom, of anti-colonial struggle, or in the case of some former colonial powers, the absence of struggles for freedom. And these are things I have learned over the last 12, 15 years or so by working quite intensely in different German museums and different German university settings on matters of restitution, when our German colleagues are talking the language of decolonization. And some of them refer to themselves, like the activists do, as post-colonial. And remember, as we move between languages, even in this conference, we need to understand the different ways in which we attribute meaning to these phenomena. So our German colleagues, for example, lost their colonies at the end of World War I. And they had subsequent extremely traumatic experiences that you know about, that our German colleagues regard as fundamental in determining who Germans are as a nation. And for us to make an argument to them that, well, actually, you cannot separate those matters of mass murder and Holocaust from earlier histories of genocide in German colonial history, and how the extent to which Germany has been made by that genocide, and how significant that historical experience was. But having lost their colonies, they did not face African freedom movements in the 1950s and the 1960s. They didn't go through disciplinary reconfiguration as other countries did in the face of such struggles. And so what's been always very interesting for me to notice about Germany is the extent to which those discussions have been taking place on the basis of a 19th century structure of disciplines. And I will talk a little bit more about that. And the other thing that I always noticed about my engagement with colleagues in Germany is the extent to which our German colleagues always declare themselves to be part of something they call the West. This desire for being Western and of identifying Westernness almost like an ahistorical kind of ontology is quite remarkable. And maybe we've had a little bit of that in this conference. And I want to put it to you that the idea of Westernness is a politics, not a state of being. It is a politics. And this idea of Western, which is often accompanied in Germany by the idea of the non-West, the non-Western museum. And we've had it a little bit here as well. This idea of many people in the world occupying the space of being known in the negative. Something that you will know, the South African activist and scholar Stephen Bantu Biko wrote about in the 1970s, this idea of being thought of as a non-white and a non-person, this idea of challenging being known in the negative. So it was quite remarkable that as the Humboldt Forum was being formed, the people driving that project had no shame in constantly referring to that museum as the non-Western museum. It is the non-Western museum. So this idea of a space of consignment of the non-West into the ethnological museum, sometimes kind of rebranded as World Museum, Valid Museum, and so forth, but still an ethnological space. And in the case of our German colleagues, a 19th century ethnology. And those of us who work in Germany will know that our German colleagues also have disciplines that are tied to places. So a lot of my work then talks about this, my discovery that in Germany, well, actually, anthropology does not mean anthropology that we talk about in English. Because when we talk about anthropology, we actually mean social and maybe cultural anthropology. Physical anthropology, maybe in the United States it includes physical anthropology. But that disciplinary distinction got made in Germany between anthropologie as physical anthropology and ethnology, sometimes now also referred to as cultural and social anthropology, and there are complicated disciplinary histories there. But as someone trained in the field of African history, in the wake of African struggles for freedom, that sub-discipline of history, that claim to historicity of the placement of African societies into the discipline of history, is not something that occurred in Germany. You cannot study African societies, for the most part, in the discipline of history in Germany. At best, you'd be able to study the history of empire in Africa, and probably not in a history department. Maybe one or two here and there, but generally still in that department, that disciplinary space called Africanistic, which is distinct, very different from what we in English call African studies. African studies is a very different disciplinary space that emerged as part of African liberation and African freedom, out of a configuration of colonial disciplines of research. So we need to always think what we mean by this. The idea of occupying the ethnological without African history is very peculiar, because as someone trained in African history, we were also necessarily trained in social and cultural anthropology, and in the contest between history and anthropology, very precisely. And there isn't a singular anthropology. There isn't a singular ethnology. There are very different experiences and claims in the Americas, on the African continent, and in different parts of Europe. So, for the most part, Germany continues to be a society in which ethnology in the university and the museum continues to be the discipline of the people without history. That is the space, that is the museum that attends to the culture people, the people depicted as not being part of the great historical movement of humankind. So, the idea, I have realized more and more how my own scholarship in museum studies, in fact, is grounded in the different facets of the field of African history. of that field that incorporated historical study based on non-written sources, based on orality, based on archaeology. So this idea of separating archaeology and African history is something that we have rejected, something that we in my own department, we have renamed ourselves from history to historical studies, incorporating very different practices of pastness. We need to understand the different ways in which colonialism has manifested itself in different parts of the world. That in the Pacific, sometimes also referred to parts of it as Oceania, the part of the world which gave us all of the central concepts of anthropology and which have given to us some of the most important concepts in the field of museum practice and museum studies, come from the Pacific. The idea of the gift, the idea of understanding collections as emerging from humane relations of gifting and of equal exchange. The idea of former colonizers and the former colonized now being in a relationship with each other that we refer to as being entangled, comes out of the colonial experience of the Pacific. Perhaps a colonial experience that in some places has not come to an end in a formal sense. And it is this experience of colonialism that gave us this idea that we are all connected and that you will be able to read for yourself in the response by our colleague, Nick Thomas, to the Savoir report, in which he declared that we have transcended these questions of restitution because we have entered into partnerships and co-curatorships. We have transcended all of those demands. And some people then put it that those demands for restitution are couched within nationalist terms, that in fact we can do better and we can do exchanges and we can now just resolve to understand that we are entangled with each other. And I want to suggest to you that that museology, and it's the museology that gave rise to the project previously referred to in our conference, Curatopia. That project, for me, represented what I thought was a neo-colonial understanding of the museum, rather than a revolutionary concept, one that can lead us to a new humanity and a new ethics of humanity. And I should be framing that in much more collegial and gentle terms, because I do have the opportunity to meet with colleagues from Papua, colleagues from New Zealand, and learn from them about restitution, where I think in South Africa we would be able to, we should adopt the New Zealand model of repatriation and then restitution because of how practical it is and how suggestive it is. And I will come to that now. But I speak from the position of a society that is so marked by multiple colonialisms and colonialities. We don't have a single colonialism. We have been made by a mercantile colonialism of enslavement by the VOC, by the Dutch East India Company. And it is a really remarkable thing that experience of enslavement, of slavery, was experienced only in one part of South Africa that had been colonized by the Dutch. And it is not the historical experience that determines South Africa's national history. Not at all. So we have this, and we are going through discussions right at the moment with the Dutch on what to do about those legacies of Dutch colonialism and enslavement. We can speak to the Dutch in a version of their language. We can speak to them in this version of colonial Dutch in a creolized form that was first written in Arabic script, because it is an Ajami. It is an African coastal Creole Ajami. So the way that we have to engage with the Dutch is becoming more important to us, and that we live with that Dutch colonialism. We live with the struggles taking place on the banks of the Lisbech that we have almost lost in the face of a practice of heritage governance that regards heritage as something to be recovered from the ravages of development in a kind of a deformed collecting and display institution. And that is the function of the persistence of a Dutch colonialism. We have a British colonialism that has shaped us, that has made us speak this language, often in a way that's better than the British. As African people, as Creole African people, we live with all of the vestiges in our churches, in the legacies of the missionaries, in our education systems. We live with a legacy of British colonialism. We live with legacies of an internal colonialism, a colonialism of a special type, a settler colonialism that we share with countries like Brazil, Australia, New Zealand. We have much in common when we think of the history of national museums. And then we have the colonialism exercised by South Africa over Namibia. South Africa was both colonized and colonizer. We have multiple colonial legacies that we need to attend to. And with that came the violence of the apartheid state that was meted out on other societies in Southern Africa, such as Angola. These are legacies these are colonial legacies, multiple legacies, and it's not as if one goes away to be replaced by the other. They come to exist simultaneously, and they exist in your skin, they exist in your body, they exist in your heart. You are overcome by it as you struggle against colonialism and apartheid. Because the most important way in which colonialism endures is in knowledge systems, in epistemologies, and in disciplines. That we work in one of the most fundamental institutions of empire and colonialism, the museum. The museum has been bequeathed to us as a disciplinary institution marked by colonial disciplines that we think of as the natural order of things. So when we think about transdisciplinarity, we're not just a coming together of different disciplines and thinking about how to live inside of different disciplines and a conversation between them in order to enhance future possibilities. The question arises, how can we become anti-disciplinary? How can we challenge the boundaries of disciplines and what they do to us. How can we critique and rethink museum disciplines on an anti-colonial basis? And this is something that we have had to confront in South Africa, as you can imagine. The struggles for freedom from apartheid in the 1980s, the 1970s, the 1980s in particular, in a time of my own consciousness as a student and as an activist, was a struggle against racism. Not just the struggle against racial discrimination, but a struggle against the very concept of race, the very idea of race that was invented by science and invented by the museum and put into practice by politicians. I mean, my parents were much more victims of racism and apartheid than I and my brothers and sisters, the people of my generation, were. But we were young enough to experience all of the ways in which the apartheid state functioned. So, what did that mean for the museum? How do you take the museum structure of apartheid, of colonialism and apartheid, and make that structure to be fit for purpose in a society that wanted to be democratic? Because you had that fundamental colonial distinction in South Africa as well, of the distinction between the people without history and the people with history, of the distinction between cultural history and ethnology. And remember, in English, ethnology is often given a softer touch by being called ethnography. It's almost like an alibi, because the ethnographic has other meanings as forms of research that many of us do, not just a classificatory division in the museum, not just a disciplinary space for the uncivilized. But this idea of the ethnological was something completely and utterly untenable in a democratic South Africa. So one of the gifts of South Africa to the world was to demonstrate that it is possible. It is possible to decommission these disciplines in a museum, to live with the legacies of those disciplines, and to struggle against those every day. And by the way, in English, we have this way of using language, post-apartheid, post-colonial, with a hyphen and without a hyphen, which mean very different things. Our German colleagues do not have that distinction. Post-colonial always has a hyphen. And I also noticed that some of our colleagues during the conference in their titles use post-colonial without a hyphen where they mean post-colonial with a hyphen. Because post-coloniality is a politics. It's not a time. It is not a time. It's a politics. Post-apartheid is a politics that recognizes that you live with the afterlives. But this is also an opportunity for us to rethink disciplines, to remake them, to make them in the practice of museography, of doing so through collections management, where you don't have the ceramics of Europe over there, sometimes to which are added the ceramics of Egypt. You don't do that. And African ceramics in another place. You put them all together and you see what happens. So this in Iziko Museums of South Africa, this has happened in a disciplinary space that somehow that council decided to call social history. Now, I don't know how useful the term social history is, but it is that post-disciplinary space that has decommissioned that classificatory division. And that is something that is taken to be a feature of the modern museum everywhere, now into the 21st century, that the place where you go to experience African societies at the Smithsonian is in the Natural History Museum, apart from the National Museum of African Art, which has a different story. And the place where you go to experience these societies of sub-Saharan Africa, this division. We are divided into these colonial systems of sub-Saharan Africa, with North Africa given over to what the Germans call the Orient, this so-called Middle East, or the East that is near to us, that is almost part of us, and it's near to us, and of Asia being a different classification system. But with Latin America having made it into the discipline of history by being 19th century nations, somehow made it, except for their indigenous people and the indigenous peoples of the America who come to belong in the Museum of World Cultures. So we need to think very seriously about the coloniality of disciplines in the museum, and to think about how that works in Portugal, how that works in Spain, how that works in this part of Europe that was once regarded as part of Africa. This history of the way the world has been divided. So this brings me to the study of restitution and what all of this means for the work of restitution. And I don't even need to go through these things now, because Lennon Mishi has so beautifully presented some of these ideas to you just a short while ago. But we are learning so much about what restitution means. And we will continue that learning in a week's time in Cape Town, where we will have an African gathering to talk about these things, to talk about nation and community, about the importance of policy making and the importance of alliances and what you need for restitution. Because you must remember that also some of our colleagues who work in very, very important restitution projects, activist projects, NGOs, research projects, a while ago became also a little anxious that restitution was being stolen by Europeans. Some European scholars were publishing books on restitution and, the Benin bronzes and, so many book launches all over the world that they were getting really anxious about this. And I would say to them, well, actually, Europeans can't do restitution. Our task as Africans, as African scholars and activists, our task is to help our colleagues in European museums with the struggles that they are engaging in their own societies on matters of restitution. They are facing accusations of wokeness. They are facing the idea that, well, actually we cannot do returns because our law says we cannot. That we have responsibilities rather to keep. We are keepers. We are carers. The very discourse of the museum is anti-restitution. So, I said, it's very important for us to recognize what restitution is and how it is distinct from what our European colleagues need to do. They need to give. And giving the work of giving, of demanding so that giving is possible, part of the restitutionary work that Lenin spoke about, is not the same as restitution. Restitution is not an event that happens in a government garden or on the veranda of the central meeting place in a community. Restitution is all the ongoing work of social restoration. We went to the opening of the very important exhibition last night, and we must thank our colleagues for that, for the care with which they have sought to intervene in the very limited possibilities of how they could intervene. But as I've said to them, those interventions have got to go into the vitrine, because we have already been presented with this idea that actually you should not remove the exhibition because you are removing history by doing that. And well, you know that faced with the same argument of a fascist exhibition, no, you can't remove that exhibition because you will be removing history, will not be possible. You will not allow such a fascist exhibition to continue to exist. Well, we had what was called an African Cultures Gallery in Iziko South African Museum, or in the separate South African Museum, which is a museum of natural history and of the native people. We had a combination of physical anthropology, the study of bodies of Khoisan people, through the display of body casts made for the purposes of racial study, but placed in an invented scene of culture, together with dioramas of tribal life, made according to the thinking of the state's own anthropologist in the Department of Native Administration, in which Khoisan people were ruled as members of a race, and Bantu-speaking African people were ruled as being members of tribes. So you had these different disciplines in this museum of ethnology and physical anthropology. And of course, work that I'm known for is my book, Skeletons in the Cupboard, that identified the origins of that museum as lying in the stolen dead body of Khoisan people, right? Through deals over the bodies of the dead, thefts from graves, and purchases also of the bodies of people before they died that were consigned for the museum. And we had, conversely, a museum of cultural history, of a narrative of period rooms that moved through stages of historical development that started in ancient Greece and ancient Rome, that moved through London and culminated in Cape Town. That division was untenable. And what we did in those museums is the displays were removed. The African Cultures Gallery was decommissioned. It was taken down. And I'm so sorry that our colleague Wandile Kasibe has not been able to be with us to talk about his doctoral research on those struggles, on what he called the need for a museum truth commission about the violence of the museum. What I'm saying to you is that restitution involves more than just the physical movement of material culture and of the remains of our ancestors. that indeed restitution involves epistemic work of rehumanization, of enabling people to see themselves in the museum as historical subjects, as people who make history. They need to be able to recognize themselves. They need to be able to see themselves being respected in the museum, not turned into objects of ethnology and objects of racial science. And so the question arises, what happens when we do restitution? Well, one of the first steps that we do, something that I discuss with different museums in Germany and the Netherlands. The first thing that we do, first stage when you decide to do a Rückgabe, as our German colleagues call it, and our Dutch colleagues increasingly calling it a Teruggawe, instead of a much better word that they have of a Terugbesorging, caring, giving with care. The first step is to remove the material from your collection, to de-accession. Take it out of the museum governance system. In other words, to de-objectify it, because we have used the term object without any sense of history, without any idea of how object is a concept of museum governance, that we have belongings that might be acquired, possibly by force and violence, and objectified and classified. And there you can do a close-up study of how that happens, of where that happens in the registration room, of how a birth certificate is given. And we've seen examples of such birth certificates, what they describe, what they don't describe. The process of rendering a belonging that has had life and a sociality into a museum object, and to then start the work of de-objectification and de-ethnologization, to take it out of the museum's knowledge system. So we have to recognize that there need to be reverse processes that have to be undertaken. That this is the active work of decolonization. And decolonization is anti-colonial work. And it will be the work of the registrar. It is the work of the curator. We have also spoken about the need for rehumanization, because there have been histories of dehumanization, of being rendered into an object, and what it means to become a person again. Because in the way in which we face, and we are made to face up to returns of Rückgabe, of our encounters with the Kontaktstelle on colonial Provenienzforschung, on facing up to these structures of governance, to face up to the work of provenance, the very important work that we hear about, that we must be supportive of, that these processes of Rückgabe, of giving, happen within European museum classificatory systems. Very problematic. And so our German colleagues now, after 10 years of work, that we did on the advisory board of the Van Luschan collection in Berlin. When our very first meetings, for the first couple of years, saw historians and anthropologists engage with human biologists from the Max Planck, in which they were trying to make a case for themselves as having potential answers. That they hold science and they need access to what they called human remains for their research. And this was a matter of how do you balance the interests of communities with the interests of science. Well, it took that society with the Holocaust in the background and its relationship with the dead 3 years to get to the point where it was clear that there was no way that any museum in Germany would be able to hold onto the remains of colonial dead people. That was not the history of the way the dead entered the museum. Because at the beginning of the 20th century, before those deep divisions occurred between anthropology and ethnology, the very same scientist who collected the dead also made sound recordings and collected what was called material culture and took photographs and collected art. And that was the case with a Polish scholar by the name of Czekanowski, who collected 1,000 skulls from what we now call Rwanda, but who also made sound recordings. So the discussion on the return of the dead has been taking place separately from the discussion on the return of what museums call objects and of what we can call documentation. So having learned from that, the South African policy might be the first policy that insists that we have to put the dead and their possessions together. That we have to talk about restitution of the bodies of our ancestors at the same time as we talk about the restitution of artworks, of material culture, of possessions, of belongings, and of documentation. This is something that we learnt when we did the restitution of the remains of Klaas and Troy Pinaar from Vienna to be buried back in Kuruman in 2012. And I'm very pleased that we had a very powerful presentation today about how restitution has been occurring in an episodic and unintegrated way. And that lack of integration, it was argued, might lead, in fact, to the failure of restitution. So how do we do inventories? How do we do provenance research that is able to bring all of these different kinds of materials together? And then how do we, in fact, do the work of restitution? Something that we know about that this distinction is important because our colleagues in Namibia had the return of the dead from Charité in the effort to return the dead of the genocide, but they didn't have a project. What did it mean? What do you do with returns? So there's all of this work to do. And so, finally, as Lennon Mishi has explained to you, that the work of restitution is not singular. It does not end. You do not end your relationship with the societies from whom collections entered your museum. But you place your relationship with those societies on a fundamentally ethical footing by entering into restitutionary work. But how do we do that? How do we build African claims making? Because claims making will ensure that restitution will occur on African terms. Because our European colleagues, in their budgetary systems and in their desire to do returns as quickly as possible, are ensuring that what we have actually is a struggle between repatriation and restitution. And we need to ensure that restitution is able to win out and that the terms of return happen on our terms. And because this is really the work of rehumanization, not just the rehumanization of African people, but the rehumanization of Europeans as well, and of remaking our relationships with each other on a much more ethical basis, in which we recognize that, yes, there are many facets to return. We've heard there are diplomatic aspects, there are legal aspects, we've heard about that, and sometimes strategically that is important. There are diplomatic aspects, there are logistical aspects. Is it on a ship? Is it on a train? Is it in a box? How much does it cost? But this is the work that happens in the relationship between descendants, communities, and activists. And those are the people who we have to turn to make sure are able to lead these processes. States are decisive in restitutionary work, but left up to themselves, national governments cannot do the work of restitution. That is the work of community and activism. We need to inaugurate a new museology that is based on restitutionary work. That is the future of the new museum. Thank you very much.
Thrilling and thought-provoking presentation by Professor Ciraj Rassool. You touched on many points. One of the biggest issues that you looked at, the idea of transdisciplinarity. Is it about working together as different disciplinarians, or it's actually doing away with the different disciplines that we have within the museum institution? You also talked about epistemology as one aspect actually that propagates the challenges that we are facing in our current museums, especially when it comes to the problem of colonialism, and even the idea of multiple colonialisms and also multiple decolonialisms. You also looked at, traced back even to the invention of race by scientists, and also you connect it even to the events that are happening in the Cape, the battle between the Khoisan and the Portuguese in the 1600s on the Lisbon River and Observatory. So those efforts and those confrontations and how we are now forging on in terms of the big issue of restitution, to say in this age that we are living, is it just about returning the object, or it's a process that brings humanization? And I'm sure, ladies and gentlemen, we have learned that the process of humanization is not only benefiting those who are getting the objects, but also even from where the objects are coming from, especially when you think about the dichotomy of Africa and Europe, it also brings humanization here in terms of how we view Africans, how we view Europeans, and how we think about in terms of representing different peoples. And linking it with the work at Iziko Museums of South Africa, particularly in the Cape, the legacy of the colonial divisions within the museum, Department of Ethnology, and now thinking about it as the Social History Center. If you visit Cape Town today, there is the Social History Center that relates to the history of places like the Cape. And these terminologies, it's also interventions that are kind of like rethinking in terms of how we represent past cultures, especially for those who know there was a very popular diorama that he kind of like talked about, which depicted the Khoisan. You know, the terminology, especially from archaeologists and cultural anthropologists about man the hunter and depicting a hunting kind of background, you know, within like the Khoisan lifestyle, everyday life, and them eventually taking it apart and of course now rethinking about like how they can represent that. But you know, the same challenges, I would say, they are still present. For instance, if you visit New York today, if you visit the American Museum of Natural History, they are still confronted with this problem. You know, previously it used to be the Royal Museum of Africa. Of course, they've reworked their exhibitions, but still there's a lot to be done there. But the whole of peoples of Africa at the American Museum of Natural History relates to what Ciraj is talking about. If you see how peoples from Africa are represented, you know, it's unimaginable that they still have a whole which is called the Halls of Peoples of Africa, you know, especially in this time that you're talking about. But this is a thought-provoking presentation that I guess we have questions, we want to engage with it, so let's take advantage of that. So we are taking questions.
Thank you very much for your talk. I am Sophie Kotani. I have only Hungarian ancestors, but by chance I live in Germany where I studied filmmaking and anthropology, ethnology in Berlin. And I work in Africa since '76, quite a long time. Cape Verde, Guinea-Bissau, Mozambique, Congo, Rwanda. It was very interesting, your talk, but at the same time, I'm a little bit surprised because in the country where we are here, it's the same. Anthropology is ahistorical, the most left, a lot of very nice left people are convinced that they brought civilization to Africa through Britain. And these are very left Portuguese people, my wonderful husband. So they fought for independence of these countries. So it's really complicated because what you said of ahistorical, I would suppose that probably it is most anthropology, perhaps in the world, in any case, in Europe. Belgium, France, UK, everywhere. So I'm surprised, you know, it's very loved to use the Germans as the very bad ones. And I have, my mother had 2 uncles who died in the Holocaust, in the Shoah. I found one name in the archives, German archives. And the philosophy master of my father, he came back from Auschwitz with 1 lung and went to Düsseldorf. Because he said he lived in Düsseldorf, he died in Düsseldorf. Knew the German philosophers and never made the confusion between the Nazis and the Germans. He always made a difference. So, frankly, the director we will see tomorrow, Marta Lorenzo, she's the director von Monarch. She says, which is the Natural History Museum von Lisbon. She says the best protocol for so-called repatriation from human rest is the German one. She says that I think she compared all them. And already doing it, while in Portugal, no clue to do it. Even it's very difficult to speak about it, to give back 3 skeletons from young Mozambican people. They know the name, they know the place from where they come, and there is not possibility to speak about it. So frankly, we have to push back a little bit the things at the places, because what you spoke about Namibia, I didn't follow it in details, but last year there was a wonderful film about this horrible story of the genocide, which came in Arte, was made through German context. Great film. A few months before, it was a fantastic presentation in the Haus der Kultur der Welt from a group reconstituting a village and the whole genocide there. So there are huge activities, not from the museums, not from Humboldt, which remains quite colonial, but a lot of stuff is happening, real reparation. So let us be a little bit just. That was my point, because we have here the question for me is, what do you think, how such a country like Portugal could start reparation by restitution? Could you please tell us from your experience, what would be your suggestion? What is the way? That would be very helpful.
Thank you, Ciraj. That was quite interesting. Just a very quick one. Just your thoughts on what do you think about restitution work in terms of curatorial work being proactive and what we normally call conditional or unconditional repatriations or restitutions? What does it mean to, in this work of restitutions, to repatriate or return unconditionally or conditionally? And how can curators be proactive without waiting for the so-called claims, which also operate within the museum governmentality that you're speaking about? You know, you need to de-accession, that's fine. But in a case where these objects cannot even accessioned, what do curators do to be proactive to facilitate the unconditional or conditional restitution work?
Thank you very much for it was really, really interesting. And I was really touched by your plea for an African claim making. I think it's very crucial. So I really, and on African terms. But my question is then, I've got another one. My question is, what is the road to this African claim making? Because maybe as a matter of comparison, I think between the Netherlands and Indonesia, Indonesia is really taking the lead now in the claim making, and it makes the whole process easier in a way. So that's one question. And the second is, you've been talking most of the time about Africa. Could we change in your contribution, Africa by Asia or South America?
Thank you so much for these great challenges and contributions, colleagues. We work very closely with the Museum Association of Namibia and with the University of Namibia, and watch developments in Namibia very closely. And obviously this focus on the genocide and understanding those violences as a genocide, as much as it is important as a way of making claims on Germany about recognition of a genocide and putting on the agenda the idea of reparations. These are also a way of empowering people. And it's happening in many different mediums, through theater, through film, and these are very difficult because the communities who see themselves as the descendants of the communities of the extermination order, do not like the involvement of the national state in negotiations with Germany. And Germany is worried about the implications of a recognition of a genocide and of the possibility of reparations as payment, because they have a relationship of development cooperation with the Namibian state. So that's how they sometimes prefer those things. But they have set a precedent for how they have dealt with these histories of mass violence. And so that is the argument that is being made by Namibians. And in those returns from Charité in 2011, the Germans made a deliberate decision not to return remains in their collection that were labeled Ovambo. A deliberate decision, because they argued that those could have been the remains of people from Angola. They did not know that they would be from Namibia. That is the argument. And I suppose their focus was also on the remains of people murdered in the genocide. So these are ongoing developments. These are ongoing. There is a very beautiful PhD by our colleague, Dr. Memory Beaver, about how the genocide is remembered on different sides of the Garib River, of the Orange River, and how that memory work happens through reenactment. And one of the contributions that we have made in this discussion has been also to ask for a shift away from an understanding of repair and reparation as payment, as important as that is, but not to neglect the work of social repair, of reparatory work, through cultural projects, through social projects, through drawing on people's agency. I've been told that one of the pacts that has been entered into by the former colonial powers is not to open up the floodgates. That if the Germans were to think of reparations, then it's going to open up Belgium, it's going to open up Portugal, it's going to open up all of these. And I want to suggest that it might not be the floodgates having already opened, but the dam has been breached. And we are now living in the time of the escalation of this. And there is work happening all the time to prevent and to stop and stall it happens. We are all involved in that. The work in which governments put resources into collaborative ventures, and we all get turned into advisors for this and that. We do a little bit of museums lab, we do all of these things, because we all become incorporated into that struggle and the contest between the anti-colonial work and the work of stopping the full extent of what that can mean in the future. But there is so much happening at the moment, we are about to enter an extremely dangerous period, unexpectedly, in a short space of time, a very dangerous period that's going to curtail mobility. It is going to, we've got the specter of war as we speak. Right now, we are going to use the opportunity as much as we can of South Africa's presidency of the G20 to advance the cause of restitution in all of the political forums that we have access to, and to do so on a Pan-African basis, to do so on the basis that creates the widest unity in the global South, so that we continue to work with our colleagues in Latin America, we continue to work with our colleagues in Asia, in the Pacific, because we all have a stake in the future of the world, that the world cannot be run on the terms of North America and Europe. You know, we made an argument a long time ago that European museums and curators have got to be proactive. They've got to do the work. They've got to do the provenance research. They've got to do the preparation. Because often in the governance of restitution, in the way that it works legally and politically, European institutions require a formal demand to be made, because then restitution will not happen. So we need to advance African capacities to make those demands, and to do so strategically and in a way that bears results. But this is all-sided work. It is the work that has to happen in European museums of provenance research. It is the work that has to happen on the side in African societies. And right now we are at a point where we are having difficult conversations about what is the relationship between communities and descendants and national governments. Do you need national policy? We have said to the Germans that you need a national approach, because our German colleagues thought that individual museums can do restitutions to individual communities in a way that violates sovereignty. And our colleagues in Namibia, the Museums Association, used to complain that you have 10 different museums from different provinces in Germany coming to a single organization on different days of the week to do partnerships and provenance research together. And they used to wonder, can't you all come together on one platform so that we don't duplicate ourselves every time, because we only have 4 people in the office. You know, so the strategy and tactics of how you do it, how you attend to the politics, the governance, the diplomatics, and how you make sure that it is community driven and that it attends to, and that it is also driven by activists. We must remember that often none of this would happen without the activists. And one of the central questions for me then has been, who speaks for the dead and who speaks for the belongings? Because our German colleagues often think that when it comes to the matter of the dead, that you bring in the human biologist. Well, when you decide to return the dead, I'm afraid human biology ceases to be an appropriate discipline of the ancestors. And it doesn't help to just add a historian, as our German colleagues always do. They add Holger Stocker or an archivist into the process. This is an opportunity, I've said, for African diasporic communities to stand in place of the communities to be the spokespersons for the dead until such time as descendants are able to be present. And it's enormously privileged work to go into the collection store of the medical museum, the medical institute at Strasbourg, where you have a German collection that has gotten lost in a French nation and in a French institution, now subject to French law. And you have heard how much our Tanzanian colleagues from Old Moshi and from Kilimanjaro are desperately seeking the skulls of their ancestors, and where for the one of the few times where I agree with DNA research, because it's about identification, to find the dead. And then the reason why you can't find the dead is actually they're not in Germany, they're in France. And to be with the colleagues when the cupboard is opened and you are faced with 50 skulls. And for the Tanzanian colleague to be with me when I am presented with the skull of a person from the battlefield, the colonial battlefield in KwaZulu. And so we are learning, so how do you do these returns? We've developed a methodology for returning the dead of anti-apartheid fighters, and to do so in cost-effective ways. What our New Zealand colleagues have done is they have empowered their National Museum of Te Papa in Wellington to act on behalf of indigenous people and to go to Europe, North America, and to bring the ancestors home into a special funereal space, because this is the work of mourning. When you do rehumanization, you are doing mourning work. This is the work, and you require different instruments. The museums have got to learn how to do the work of mourning, how to create the spaces for mourning. And so it's, so that is what we are learning on a case-by-case basis. And it is tragic work. It is the work of just realizing just how brutal, what brutality we are sitting with, in where everything has been covered up by a lie of a gift and of humaneness. And we are realizing just the extent to which our hands are dripping with blood. And to do the cleansing and the mourning and the healing is going to take generations of work. But we have to do it. So, proactive work we have to support our curators who do that work. We shouldn't just say that they are Europeans, even if some of them are African, that they are stealing restitution. African claims making is important then, as part of building African claims making capacities, because there's no template here. We've got to know how to frame it, what to do, how to demand access to inventories, full access. We tried that very early on with the Austrians, because we said, we will take the remains of Klaas and Troy Pienaar, we can name 5 more people, but we need to sit, your scientists and our scientists, and we need to agree on an inventory of what will be returned. We need to enter into an agreement through a memorandum of understanding. You know what the Austrians did? They sent a draft MOU about opera, because they said that's what we do. Well, quite frankly, it just did not work. Luckily, we are now in a different phase. We're able to have much more effective discussions. I mean, let's face it, we're at a very different time than we were. You know this, Jos, because you have done the work. You follow it more closely than any of us. That we do have cause for hope. That is why we do the work. And some societies in Europe are lagging behind. Some are not just lagging behind, they drag their feet. In fact, they put up barriers. But the damn wall has been breached. And it is conferences like this that bring us together. And we must enhance and encourage each other. Because this is all of our work. And my best to all of you in doing this work.